everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show. I am Dr. Duke, and I am joined today by a neat guest, and I hope we're going to have him on regularly. His name is Daniel Natal. He's a very serious intellectual from my 2 cents, and he also is the host of the Daniel Natal Show for the New American Magazine, and I very much urge you to find him there. We'll let him plug that at the end of the show, and hopefully you will start watching him there as well. Daniel, thank you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on, Duke. I'm a great fan, as you know. So
we've talked about this briefly before, and I wanted to spend a whole period, 24 minutes, talking to you about this. I want to talk about the Roman Republic. And most Americans have no idea that the first republic was actually Rome. But then how would they when they don't even know that America is a republic? They think we're a democracy. So let's start there. Let's talk a little bit briefly about what this republic was, when it got started, what they conceived, just so people get a sense who don't understand Roman history. I'll let you start anywhere you want to.
Okay. I'm going to be annoying, and I'm going to start with Aristotle's Politics. And Aristotle said that governments that we would think of as republics usually start with farmers, with agrarian populations. And he said in Politics that when you have farmers who have to spend so much of their time in the fields, they're going to typically have a pared down form of government that is, it's not overbearing, it's not overarching. And so when you look at the early Romans, they kind of conformed to that, just like in the United States. In 1776, I think 91% of the population was in some form of agriculture or a related industry. All the founding fathers, the overwhelming majority were gentlemen farmers. So we were an agrarian population, and so was Rome. Thomas Madden points that out, that Rome, even though Italy's a peninsula, they basically, for large sections of their history, they ignored the sea. They really didn't have a navy for quite a long period, and they were just basically an agrarian population. And so naturally, in conformity to what Aristotle said, they did develop these rudimentary forms of government that kind of took root after the king was Tarquin. And they got sick of, tyrants. And so after Tarquin, they basically wanted a form of government that was divided purposely so that no one man could take over. And so a lot of the sociological underpinnings that led to the Roman Republic also led to the American Republic. So that's an interesting thing. And one of the things too, I'll shut up in a second and let you tell it. But one of the things too that's interesting is because of this prerequisite of an agrarian population, it's really, really hard to kind of transfer our form of government, say, to Nazi Germany, which was a highly industrialized society, or to any other part, or to Iraq, these civilizational, levels that different people are at. It's really hard to graft one person's, constitution onto another people. And Hegel says that. He says in Phenomenology of Mind, he says that the constitution of a country is the embodiment of the ethos of a people. And he said it is very shallow to think that you can graft the constitution of one people onto another people. And that's why we've seen kind of countless failures of Americans, thinking that they can nation build and kind of, and we're even losing it ourselves after the Industrial Revolution, and we ceased being an agrarian population, and it goes down from, 93%, whatever it was, to like, 1%, I think today, people are farmers in the country. We start getting these ideas of mechanized government, bureaucracy, because you need those for a factory system. You need micromanagement. You need this managerial class. And that's where our deep state basically emerged as we transitioned away from the agrarian population. It's very, very hard to keep a republic, when the technological underpinnings kind of shift and change. So.
Yeah, let's take one step back a little bit for our audience. So Aristotle, who you start with, of course, theorized republics. We really didn't have a serious republic before Rome, and of course, the Roman Roman Republic actually existed before the birth of Aristotle. So what happened about roughly 750 A.D. when Rome became a city? As you mentioned, it had a number of kings, a handful of kings, and with each successive king, the Romans became more and more disconcerted by them. They started appropriating more wealth. They started, at one point, which was the breaking point, a Roman king actually raped a virgin girl, which outraged the people of Rome, and they had a rebellion. Interesting, it was a Brutus, another Brutus, who helped push back against the Roman monarchy. And within about 100 years or so, you had the very first republic anywhere in the world, again, a couple hundred years before the birth of Aristotle. And it was strikingly reminiscent in some ways to what we have, the Senate. Our concept of the Senate in the American Republic was taken directly from the Romans. And they didn't have a Congress, so to speak, but they did have a house for the plebes, for the average people. They had elected offices like tribunes who served the lower house, if you can use that anachronistic term. You had a kind of bifurcated government, very much in theory, at least, like what we were going to have. So sociologically speaking, before you even had a political theorist like Aristotle talking about these forms of government, we actually had one in the West. And of course, the founding fathers, when they considered what kind of a country they wanted us to be, they had two major influences. One was the ethos, the moral imperative of the Gospels and the Old Testament. That sort of shapes the ethical and moral framework of our country. But when it comes to civil governance and rational government, they went right back to the Romans, which was an inspired choice. I remind my university kids who don't know that why do you think it is when you go to Washington, D.C., that almost all of our famous monuments look like Roman buildings, not like Christian cathedrals? And that understanding that bifurcation, not just in government between the Senate and the People's House, but also in terms of how we borrowed rationality and democracy transformed into republicanism from the Romans, as well as the Judeo-Christian heritage. So getting back to what you were talking about, and I think it's a really remarkable point, now that we understand that, the point that you bring back is really important. They were surrounded by sea on three sides. It only took the threat from Carthage, really, 700 years later, for them to actually realize they had to have a navy. So they went for almost 6 centuries, the Romans, getting more powerful, conquering more and more, their civilization flourishing, without paying any attention to the sea that was on 3 sides of them. And I think you have made a good point. Aristotle was right as well, that the seeds of republicanism comes from the farmers, those who are most directly responsible for feeding themselves and others, those closest to the land. And America's best periods of growth came, in most instances, before a lot of the modernization that took place in this country. Expand a little bit on what we've just said.
Well, like, just to get back to what you said earlier, and you made a good point, because Aristotle in Politics, he does refer to democracy coming from farmers, and how the Romans, like you said, what the difference between, like, the Greeks, they had the Areopagus, right? That was their chamber, their kind of legislative body, and that would be the equivalent of like a Senate, right? And so Cicero, if you read his book, wonderful book, De Republica, right? So ever pertaining to a republic. And in De Republica, he talks about how this is different from the Greek democracy, is that he said he wanted to build a government on the basis of the 3 classical forms, right? So monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, if you want to call it that, right? So those 3 together would be a republic. So monarchy would lead to like the Roman consul or our president, right? That would be the representative of monarchy. Aristocracy would be our Senate, right? Or the Roman Senate, and the House of Plebes would be the House of Commons, or in England, in the United States. So England too is set up much like that, with a king, House of Lords, and House of Commons, a tripartite setup, and that's how the United States was, and it was directly based on Cicero. I mean, the blueprint, if you open up De Republica by Cicero, it's like point by point, essentially a blueprint for the United States government. And so that is the very first republic, because it's a divided form of government, very, very purposefully. I mean, like the Romans were you mentioned Christianity. Thomas Madden talks about how the Romans, just like the Americans, were derided by the dissolute Greeks because they still believed in the gods. Like the Romans were made fun of, like kind of like how modern Europeans look at Americans and say, oh, well, look at this poll. More Americans believe in the virgin birth than believe in evolution. Ha ha ha, aren't they unsophisticated? But that level of morality is what led everybody to trust the Romans. And so Madden's book is called Empires of Trust. And he talks about how there are two different forms of empire. There is a mercantile empire, and that would be like England, right, where they spread just doing trade. But then he said there was an empire of trust, which is where people trust the actual people of a particular civilization. So they trusted the Romans to honor their word because they were a pious, moral, religious people. And so when the Romans got attacked, they basically started making defensive alliances with other groups, other tribes, and people trusted them. And so they actually spread not through conquest, but they spread through these defensive agreements with other people to try to basically create buffer zones to protect Rome. And so the United States, Thomas Madden says, is very, very similar, not just starting as an agrarian population, but also as a highly, anomalously religious place, especially compared to the Europeans. And he makes an interesting point. He says he's creating analogs, right? And so just as the Etruscans were the parent population of the Romans, he says that England is the parent population of the United States. And just as the Greeks, whom the Romans admired greatly, but were dissolute and kind of, shiftless and squabbling and stuff, were beyond the Etruscans. So in the United States, the analog would be Western Europe. So we have England as our direct parent, Etruria, and then Western Europe as Greece, where we love their culture, we love a lot of the ideals and history and stuff. But they basically look down their nose at us, just as the Greeks look down their nose at the Romans. But nevertheless, yeah, their spread happened because people trusted them. We're watching that break down now as the United States ceases to be kind of this, seen as like Henry Fonda, seen as Jimmy Stewart. That was the old image of the trustworthy kind of hayseed, but he was, a pious man. And that was our image globally. We had tremendous soft power. And now that people are ceasing to trust us, we're watching kind of an erosion of American soft power abroad. So very similar processes.
Important you mentioned Cicero's Republica, and when we think about Cicero, we think about that first century before the birth of Christ, the last 100 years of the before Christ era. And what's really interesting is that not only was Cicero the blueprint that our founding fathers, and as they read the Bible, we know that, but we also know that the founding fathers really, really paid attention to Roman history in places like Plutarch's Lives, which was both the lives of Plutarch's were biographies of an ancient Roman paired with an ancient Greek. And not only was it biographically accurate as much as Plutarch could be in the second century AD, but they were moral comparisons. We would compare Aristotle, or Alexander the Great would be compared with Julius Caesar. And that's where I want to go for a moment. Julius Caesar also lived at the same time Cicero did, and Cicero was one of the most outspoken voices that what Julius Caesar was trying to do was to undermine the Republic by making himself de facto a king. And so this is the very important period. This is the Lynch period of the Roman Republic. With the civil wars that preceded Caesar and then Julius Caesar, you really did have the final nails being driven into the Republic. One man seeking greater power, buying, and how did Pompey and Sulla and Marius and ultimately Julius Caesar, how did they transform the Republic that had been around for almost 700 years? How did they get rid of it? Well, couple of things. They used military power inside the territory of Rome rather than against their enemies. They billeted soldiers now, something that the Constitution warns us about. They billeted soldiers in Rome. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that was it, right? When he marched effectively on Rome and occupied it, even though he didn't threaten force, that changed a lot of minds, a lot of swords there. You better pay attention to Caesar. Other things that they did, going back to Marius and Sulla, buying votes, using taxpayer money to fund all sorts of giveaways to make people loyal to the givers, not to the protectors, the Republic. And so let's talk about this and shift quickly then into what all these lessons of the fall of the Roman Republic teach us about where this American Republican is heading.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Rome had different than we did, I mean, it's not 100% identical on both sides, but one of the things, mistakes that Rome probably made, kind of institutionally, was that their senators also were generals, right? So in our country, in our Constitution, like the president is commander in chief, but you don't have Senator Chuck Schumer with his own private army.
Thank God.
You don't have like all these different senators coming in, and so there was a lot of pressure from the armies to basically, have the most powerful senator because then they could get the most choice assignments. They could get like all the plunder that they wanted. So they would basically, kind of like advocate for their particular senator to, be a strong man. And so, yeah, so Julius Caesar had an army, but then so did all the other senators. So it became a very dangerous brew. Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, right? So the political scientist from England, right, in the 1600s, he basically said that for all the good things, that a republic might have, he said that one of the dangers of a republic, he said, is that in a monarchy, there's a clear ruler. And monarchies can rot and decay and turn into tyrannies, yes. But he said that the liability of a republic is because there's no clear leader that everybody can jockey for power, and it causes these internal fractious divisions, this internecine fighting. And he said, so in a time of war, he said a republic is only at peace in a time of war because they can all unify and they attack an external enemy. He said, however, peace is toxic to a lot of republics because they start fighting each other. And so, we watch this in the United States as well. As we're expanding out, we can kind of project aggression outward, whether it's against the Native Americans, in the 1800s, whether it's against Nazi Germany. I mean, we really only discovered Americanism in World War I. Before World War I, we were New Yorkers, we were Virginians, we were South Carolinians. We didn't have a real American identity like Henry Clay was pushing for, since the 1830s. But war created this idea of Americanism, and now I have an American identity. And the same thing happened to Rome. So when they were fighting Carthage, they were like, kind of unified and stuff. But when a time of peace came, it became very dangerous, and the senators turned on each other. Their personal armies would start, doing, outrages. And so, yeah, so Julius Caesar, had he not did what he did, he would have likely been assassinated, and he was assassinated anyway. I think he ruled for 4 years or something. So yeah, it was very, very dangerous times, so.
What's interesting what you said is that what the political theorists have said. Think about the wartime presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt for a moment. He did all sorts of things that in a way Caesar kind of did. He wanted to expand the Supreme Court. He filled those offices with people who were loyal to him. He did a number of things economically and culturally that you could really argue were against the Constitution. But what was it that allowed people to fight that? What was it that kept him in power? It was World War II. If it had not been for World War II and the country, as you said, the country mobilizing around one leader, as they always do, right? You said yourself, loved it. You're quoting somebody else I know, but the idea, republics are only at peace during wartime when they can rally. So Roosevelt got away with a whole lot of things he never would have, including the only president in American history to supersede that 2-term limit because of the war powers. And so it seems from that moment on, there's something really broken when you combine that with the rapid industrialization of World War II, the war machine. Seems like we turned a corner there that we couldn't turn back. The same kind of corner that they turned in Rome with the advent of Julius Caesar. Is that fair to say?
No, that's brilliantly put. Yeah, like right now, I was doing a report on the New American TV with Rebecca Terrell, and we were talking about like Vladimir Zelensky in the Ukraine and how he was demanding that the United States defend him. We have no mutual defense agreement with Ukraine. We have like 50 or so mutual defense agreements with other countries. We have no legal obligation to be in Ukraine. And this was one of the dangers George Washington warned about with entangling alliances, where he said that like if we get involved with all these countries, it's just going to draw us in. But that's how Rome expanded, through these empires of trust, where they would do these mutual defense agreements, and it kind of led the erosion of the republic, which was a very decentralized idea. And that's why, like in our country, we're very decentralized. We don't have one country, we have a bunch of states. It's very decentralized, and it was done that way on purpose, and it's very republican in nature. Like look at the Swiss Republic. It's 4 different kind of regions with 4 different languages and all these different cantons and stuff. That's the nature of a republic. They're very fractured, and as a result, it's very hard to keep them together. It's like herding cats. And so war has always been kind of a way for them to herd them. I wanted to share one thing, if I might, and I hope I'm not going to be, too annoying here, but there was this really great passage by Thomas Madden that I wanted to share along this. He said around the time of George Bush, he published the book around the time George Bush was president, and people were saying, oh, he's going to use the war to become a dictator. And he says, claiming that President Bush or any other American president is a new Pompey or Augustus is simply the kind of frivolousness to be expected in a time of Pax. It sells books and makes for good talk show fodder, but it is historically absurd. The men who overturned the Roman Republic did so by wielding raw military power against their own government. Sending the armed forces to Iraq after a supporting congressional resolution is one thing. Sending them to Washington, D.C. is quite another. If a president, no matter how popular, gave an order to the Marines to surround Capitol Hill, it would not be obeyed. That is because American troops value their oath to defend the American Constitution higher than their duty to obey their commanding officer. He wrote this, of course, before they sent in troops to surround Washington, D.C. when Biden got in during his controversial election. So he was saying, you don't have to worry until they start putting troops around the Capitol. Here we are. And it's precisely because we have these entangling alliances. We've shifted from a republic to an empire, and empires typically are kind of mean to their people.
I would argue, Daniel, that the FBI serves the role as kind of like the Praetorian Guard, so to speak, a force, a protective military force surrounding government, right? To me, that's the closest analogy. The Praetorian Guards, of course, were the emperor's own private guards during the imperial period, and they ultimately dominated Rome. He was the only one, the emperor, to allowed to have those kind of forces in the city of Rome, and so therefore nobody dared challenge the emperor, and that's why we got emperors like Caligula and Nero, who were just absolutely devastatingly horrible. My question, we've only got a little time. This is why I like having you on, Daniel. We've touched the base. We've lit a candle that could take us in 10 different directions for another half-hour talk. So this is what I kind of like, this kind of shotgun way to try to get people interested in Roman history and the fate of America. But in the short time we have left, once a republic goes, we know this from history, it does not come back. What is your moral, the one moral you take away from the history of Rome that you would use to warn Americans today?
Well, I mean, a bunch of people, make the point, from, Polybius all the way to modern scholars, is that the decline happened with the moral decline of the people. If you have an ethical and religious and pious people, you tend to get a republic. The sociologist Talcott Parsons says that. He says, people in a republic, in a productive society, they have the virtues of ethics and fair dealing. And people who go into a consumption-based society, they get into luxury and weakness and wastefulness and immorality and stuff. And so that the same thing happened to Rome. They were, in many ways, a victim of their success. They became morally loose, lax. They stopped being pious and religious. And John Adams said that about our Constitution, and I'll leave it there. He said, our Constitution was written for religious and moral people. It is unequal to the government of any other kind. And that happened to Rome,
Adams also stressed educated and moral people, right? The idea that we were both moral, and we've seen that fall by the wayside, and look at how the progressives who want to destroy the republic are undermining our republic through education. Daniel, how can people find your other show with The New American?
They can just go to The New American or go to YouTube or Rumble or anything, look up The New American, go to the video section, you'll see the Daniel Natal Show there, or you can just go to any platform, type in the Daniel Natal Show or thenewamerican.com, and you'll find it there. And I thank you so much, Duke, for having me on, and it's always a pleasure. My pleasure as well. We'll have you back next week. And that's going to wrap up this show. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to support the show, simply visit drdukeshow.com. For all of us here at the Dr. Duke Show, I want to thank everybody, and Daniel, that's a name, Daniel Natal, you're going to be hearing more of from us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.